excited for this work. As Cierra mentioned, the Communities for Just Schools Fund is a national donor collaborative. We have the great privilege of supporting grassroots organizing that is pushing for education justice all over the world. And we are proud to support, at this point, 60 organizations in more than 20 states in this country, in Toronto and in Puerto Rico. And you'll forgive the social emotional learning that's happening behind me with my children in the background, who are home from school and enjoying each other. So the strategic priorities that we have at the Communities for Just Schools Fund is first and foremost to fund the great work that we see happening, the great work that you'll hear about today, the amazing leadership of organizers all over the country who are moving the needle in terms of equity in education. You all, I'm sure, have been seeing the videos, the horrific videos of young people, Black and brown people, and especially girls, Black girls who are being brutalized in their schools. That's quite the opposite, of course, of social emotional learning. And the work that we fund is to push back against that brutality, but also to make a better world, a different world, and to really lead us to liberation, lead us to the world that we dream of in our schools for our babies. And that is our primary responsibility as a donor collaborative. We also build the community that is the Communities for Just Schools Fund. We build the community of work around safe schools and healthy schools that are equitable. And so we provide technical assistance and capacity building supports to the grassroots organizers that are doing the tremendous work in the country for our children. And then we make connections. So we help to connect grassroots organizers with philanthropy. We sit at a very important fulcrum, I think, as a funder of work, but also as a leader in philanthropy of those foundations and institutions and individuals who are really passionate and really committed to this work and really looking for authentic understanding of the work that grassroots organizers face every day and of the realities that young people in schools and their parents and families are faced with every day as well. And then finally, we are leaders. We see ourselves as leaders because we are connected to the grassroots organizing that we support. We're able to then provide some leadership in philanthropy, but also among the broader network. So the policymakers and the researchers and the others who are contributing to understanding and context around the realities that young people are facing in schools. So both the challenges, and again, to push back against the challenges that they're experiencing, but also to create a whole new reality and one that we maybe haven't even imagined yet. And so this webinar is very much a part of the strategy to think outside the box and to make sure that we're bringing conversations that are happening about social emotional learning into the realities of the organizers and the young people that we're supporting, so that they are communicating with each other and that they're being effective as much as possible, so that we can really create new learning environments for young people that are combating anti-Blackness and really embracing a new racial equity and a new path toward liberation. So thank you again for this. Thank you for joining us. And we're really, really excited for this conversation and for this tremendous start, Cierra, to this SEL series.
Thank you so much, Allison. Appreciate all of your words and so thankful that you're here with us to support us through this. And so I'm going to share my screen once again. But here we have some, a little bit of background information in thinking about the context of social emotional learning and culturally affirming social emotional learning. So what you see here is a compilation, a collection of some different news headlines that have come up over the past couple of years. And so you see on one side, some really challenging and really hurtful ways that folks are thinking about safety. And then on the other side, you see how our partners are leading the way and thinking about how do we take harmful narratives about safety and put it into a more appropriate container of culturally affirming social emotional learning. And so we know that school safety and security has claimed significant public attention over the last several decades. Often the state, district, and school level conversations that we hear most are about whether to arm teachers, to hire more law enforcement officers in schools, and put funding towards high-tech infrastructure or threat assessment, rather than how to protect and nurture the well-being and potential of every student. When asked what makes them feel safe in schools, students, families, and communities note that deep relationships with school staff and amongst students makes them feel genuinely safe. And so the narrative around safety, in many instances, has already been co-opted in ways that disproportionately affect Black and Brown communities. And so what is social emotional learning? CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, their definition of SEL is the process through which children and adults acquire and effectively apply the knowledge, attitudes, and skills necessary to understand and manage emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make responsible decisions. And so how I've taken this definition and made it really stick with me is to think about centering it in deep relationships. So deep relationships with ourselves and deep relationships with others. And so what does that look like when social emotional learning is co-opted and used in harmful ways? Dina Simmons wrote a really beautiful article, and the title is there, Why We Can't Afford Whitewash Social Emotional Learning. And in it, one of the quotes that really stuck out to me was that many popular SEL approaches do not explicitly confront these forms of violence or other social inequities. Recoiling from topics that divide us when SEL skills could help us get along better diminishes SEL's promise. Why teach relationship skills if the lessons do not reflect on the interpersonal conflicts that result from racism? Why discuss self and social awareness without considering power and privilege, even if that means examining controversial topics like white supremacy? That's Dina Simmons. And so in my role as Education Anew Fellow, I've had the privilege and the honor of being able to form connections with educators throughout the country, but specifically in the DC metro area. And walking through many school buildings over the past few months that I've been in the position, I've seen how SEL shows up in this very harmful way of thinking about social and cultural awareness as being keep your hands to yourself and keep your belongings to yourself, rather than dismantling the oppressive structures and having real, genuine conversations about how that manifests itself in relationships. And so in this moment, there's a national spotlight on what safe and supportive schools look and feel like. It is the time to highlight work that embeds a more holistic conversation about safety into conversations about culturally affirming social emotional learning and overall school and student supports. And so this work and these conversations run parallel to the demands and campaigns around positive school climate that organizers have already been advancing for many years. And so this is a great opportunity to center SEL within organizer demands for culturally affirming classrooms and schools before it's too late. And so I want to segue this into highlighting one of our partners, the Alliance for Quality Education. This is Zakia Ansari, the Advocacy Director for Alliance for Quality Education. And Alliance for Quality Education, aka AQE, all of the acronyms, AQE, they are the consultants in a project that we launched called the Community of Practice. And the community of practice creates space for our national network of partners to engage in deep strategy and learning around the intersections of school safety and social emotional learning. And so as you see in Zakia's quote, she says, "I didn't always call it culturally affirming social emotional learning, but I knew what classrooms should look like and feel like." And that sticks with me every single day as we have these continued conversations and as we engage in this work of what should it look like and what should it feel like. And so through the community of practice, CJSF and our partners and allies are, one, identifying and elevating partner efforts and situating them as experts of their experiences with SEL. Two, collaboratively building a strong case for smart, connected school climate, safety, and culturally affirming SEL policies and practices. And three, elevating our partners' work to change young people of color's educational and life outcomes by addressing broken racial and cultural narratives and pushing it back against calls to further harden schools. And so we are doing this in a few ways. One of them is through learning exchanges. For example, we went to Minneapolis, where we partnered with the Coalition to Stop the Cradle to Prison Algorithm and Twin Cities Innovation Alliance. We learned about technology and data tools such as big data, algorithms, biometrics, predictive analytics that target Black and Brown students. And we also are doing this through site visits to see what best practices look like in place. And so as a beautiful and powerful example of that, Californians for Justice, Najla will actually share on the call so you get to learn more about that work. But today we will really tap into and highlight the expertise from the important work on promising solutions that's really come out of the work of organizers, funders, researchers, and educators centered around the questions: what is culturally affirming social emotional learning, and how can we ensure that SEL policies and practices that are adopted center community and organizer demands? And so with that, I'm going to open up the space for our panel discussion. We have two incredible panelists that I have the privilege and the honor of being able to work with, Carlos and Najla, who represent fantastic organizations that are moving powerful and beautiful work in this world. So I'm going to start by introducing Carlos. Carlos Rojas is the Director of Special Projects at Youth on Board. And I have two questions for you, Carlos. One around, tell us more about yourself. What's your story? And then also, what does culturally affirming SEL look like and feel like in your work? And in that, I'm going to stop my screen share. Carlos, so excited to have you on the call.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This is just an honor, and I'm so glad to be learning from you all and to be able to share in this really beautiful community of people from across the country. So let me say a little bit about who I am, and then I'll talk a little bit about what social emotional learning looks like in our organization and in our movement building work. This is the part where I share my screen and show you a really cute picture of me. I was born in Colombia, and I came to this country when I was 5 years old. And I share this picture because that's me on the right, and on the left is Estaniola, who is, I would say, my co-conspirator in crime, co-accomplice in the work that we're doing to share with the world what we figured out about social emotional learning, which for us, we call healing justice. And I think those two things are so related. And so she's with us in spirit, even though I'm the one presenting, because a lot of the work we've done together. So I was born in Colombia, and I came to this country when I was 5, and I came without documentation. And so when we came to this country, we quickly became one of the 12 million undocumented immigrants who live in this country, who work in this country, who raise families in this country without papers. And that is probably the single most formative part of who I am and my life. I grew up knowing I was undocumented my entire life. And when you're a 5-year-old, What that means to you isn't quite yet concrete, but it means I did know I didn't have a 9-digit number, and that was a really big deal. I knew that I wasn't supposed to tell anybody, and that was really important. I had to hide and be secret about everything. What it meant was that anytime we got a form from school, like the dreaded lunch forms that always asked for your social security number, I could see my mom tense up. I could see her face turn blue and cold. And so school forms and government forms were something that I quickly learned to be afraid of. And I think that other undocumented youth probably share the same feelings. And I grew up in this country undocumented, and I watched family members be deported. I saw my own father be deported when I was 9, incarcerated and then deported. And that left really deep marks in who I am as a person. And so on the bright side, what that meant for me was that when I was 16, I knew that I needed to step out of the shadows, and I needed to say something about what was right and what was unjust. And so the fact that I grew up undocumented in this country means that I know what is supposed to be versus what we currently have for some people. And so I grew up with a sense of justice. And when I was 16, I came out in front of newspapers and in front of cameras, and I said, I'm undocumented and unafraid. And to me, that was one of the most healing things I have ever done as a person, because it meant for the first time that I could be real and authentic about who I was. And I was letting the world know that it was okay to be who I was. On the other hand, that experience left me with struggles that I still deal with every single day today. I was part of the team of people that helped to enroll thousands of young people into the DACA program when we won DACA in 2012. I remember the moment that President Obama at the time announced the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. And that changed the lives of so many immigrant youth. But no one tells you that after the policy victory is won, that might change some things, but it actually doesn't get rid of the trauma that we've all been left with. The DACA policy victory, while significant, did not cure the anxiety and depression that we know undocumented immigrant youth are experienced to this day. It doesn't cure the anxiety we get whenever we see a document or a form that we have to fill out and we're thinking, oh my God, I have to tell the government again, I don't have a social security number, or I have to tell them I have DACA. And so part of when I came into organizing, I knew that we needed to also look at how are people affected by the systems of oppression that we are living in. And so we have to fight the policies and we have to change the policies, but then what happens after that? What happens to our people in our communities? And thankfully for me, when I was 16, I also found Youth on Board. And Youth on Board is an organization that was founded 25 years ago. And our mission is to put young people at the center of the decisions that affect our lives. And so we envision a world, hopefully not too far from now, where all young people, no matter our age, have important decision-making roles in every aspect of our lives. And when I walked into a space that held that up for everyone, I knew that I was in the right space for what I needed. What I didn't realize was that in addition to the organizing that we were doing, Youth on Board also had what we call our action and support model. Quickly on at the beginning of our organization's history, we realized that we could not ask young people of color to go up against multiple systems of oppression, to organize and to advocate without social emotional support. Because what happens when you do that is you have young people that walk into your space with important baggage that they have to unpack. But instead of doing it in healthy ways, we are taking it out on each other, right? So I've been part of many youth organizing meetings where we were fighting each other, we were taking things out on each other, You have people who put all their energy into something and then we burn out and we have no way of fixing that burnout. So we lose so many incredible youth organizers and organizers, period, to burnout. We enter movements hopeful about changing the world, but often we don't have the skills to deal with a conflict with someone we love, or we don't know how to communicate effectively with an organizer that we're working together with. And so I realized pretty early on that this was critical to movement building. And today there's this funny notion that self-care is, a bottle of wine in your hot tub Friday night, and all the power to us for those of us that can figure out moments of relaxation and moments of just not doing anything. I think that's important. But for us, self-care is a collective and radical act. And then you talk about culturally responsive. So how do you actually do that by being culturally responsive? One of the things we realized as we were creating spaces for young people in our program to be vulnerable, to show us what they're feeling, to show us how they enter into their days and into their lives, was you actually can't divorce that from the system, from understanding the systems of oppression that we live under, right? And so our cultures are informed and shaped by racism and colonialism and sexism and capitalism. And as we're trying to heal from the effects of those systems, we actually have to understand those systems. And so for us, culturally relevant social emotional learning, or culturally relevant healing justice, whatever you want to call it, has to be rooted in understanding how systems of oppression work and how they affect us as individuals and as people. And one of the things that I'm reminded of often is that it is actually the oppression that wants us to not be able to feel our feelings. So I remember I walked into the program, I was 17, and many of you might share this experience. I grew up as a young boy being taught that los hombres no lloran, and in Spanish that means boys don't cry. And my cousin, who was raised as a female, was taught that las lloronas no se casan. And that means that crybabies don't get married. And so from a very early age, we had our emotions policed and our ability to show our emotions policed. And we fought against it for a while, but then at some point as we get older, we lose that fight and we stop being able to show how we feel to the people around us. And that is a direct impact of the oppressive society we live in. And so our task as people who believe in social emotional learning is how do we create containers of vulnerability for organizers, for young people, to be able to actually be vulnerable and show how they feel. And, in our program, what that looks like concretely is we have support Wednesdays every single Wednesday, where young people, in addition to the organizing we're doing, either get real concrete support to figure out college, figure out homelessness, figure out food, figure out housing. And then every other Wednesday is about the emotional support. And so we have a group of young people who every other Wednesday are getting into circle with each other and have built trusting enough relationships that they can show each other how they feel. Yes, that means that we see young people cry. Yes, that means that we see young people rage and scream. We see young people laugh, because sometimes laughing is the way that we get to process how we feel about what's going on in our lives. And so we've fostered these spaces and these containers where young people actually get to be who they are and understand that organizing isn't just about the policy victory. It also has to be about them, and it has to be about their individual liberation from the effects of oppression.
Carlos, thank you so much for being so vulnerable and for sharing all of that with everyone in this community here on the call. So much of what you said, I think, really resonates with many of us. And I have my notebook here, so I'm just writing down some notes as you're talking. And just like the fact that policy change doesn't take away from the trauma, that is so powerful and so important as we think about SEL policies and practice. How do we make sure that that actually happens in every single day interactions with young people and with each other and with ourselves, right? Just incredible. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Absolutely.
And so now I'm going to introduce Najla Gomez Rodriguez. She's the capacity building manager for Californians for Justice. And I will pose the same questions. We'd love to hear more about you and your story. And also, what does culturally affirming SEL look like and feel like in your work?
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, Carlos. I resonated a lot with what you shared. I'm appreciative. I'm gonna just have to take like 3 deep breaths to like ground myself. You're welcome to join me taking your own deep breaths, if that's helpful. All right, I'm back. Thank you. So thank you again. I encourage folks as you're listening, so there'll be a lot of storytelling today, to make note of what emotions are coming up for you as you're listening, and to take any notes as we go, especially my visual learners. Make use of the chat, you know, do what you gotta do to stay present. My name is Najla Gomez. I am the Capacity Building Manager at Californians for Justice, as was just shared. I support the work of our organizing teams in 4 school districts across California, in Oakland, San Jose, Fresno, and Long Beach. If you're not familiar with CFJ, let me set my timer. If you're not familiar with CFJ, we're a statewide grassroots-based building organization. We organize high school youth for racial and educational justice, and we have been doing so for over 20 years. More recently, out of our young people demanding that we support teachers and staff versus go up against them, we birthed our capacity building arm. And so we're also now supporting school, district, and county leaders in creating relationship-centered schools. And I'll share more about what that means to us. My story, so my introduction to advocacy also was navigating the world as an immigrant, as an undocumented young person, translating systems and services for my mom and my grandmother from a very young age. I entered the US public education system in 2001, so that was on the heels of No Child Left Behind. And I didn't understand why my 4th grade teacher made me retake the English proficiency test every week until I passed it. So Ms. Filippini was actually looking out for me. She knew if I didn't pass, I would be tracked into less rigorous classes where expectations would remain very low for me. In middle school is when school closures intensified across the country. And I remember my peers and I tried to organize against the closing of our school. We held rallies and marches to no avail. This was also around the time of the immigration marches of 2006. And I remember skipping school, you know, doing a walkout to attend the march. But it really wasn't until Californians for Justice actually found me when I was in high school that I began putting a name and giving direction to like the impulses that I was getting against injustices that I had been experiencing from a young age. So it was no longer like me against the world, like I found a collective and we were flexing people power to create change. At the time, I joined a campaign to push our district, which was Eastside Union in San Jose, to raise the graduation requirements to match those needed to apply to a 4-year university in California, also known as the A through G requirements. And we were fighting against low expectations that the district had set for students of color. And we won that fight. From there, organizing has been a constant part of my life. In 2011, I was further politicized by the Occupy Wall Street movement when I learned that our current system is not broken, but working exactly as it is supposed to. And I organized because I believe a better world is possible and we need all of us to fight for it. So my commitment to this work is my commitment to the struggle for liberation of all people. So that's me. And everything I share today really comes from the wisdom of our organizers and our young people at CFJ. And I just want to acknowledge like the privileges that I bring. You know, I'm a non-Black Latina, a cis woman, I have formal educational privilege, and I could name a lot more. So just holding that. As for defining social emotional learning, I'm going to resonate with a lot of what was already said. So CFJ also approaches this work with the recognition that our system of public education is founded on white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy, right? A patriarchy that is cisgendered and heteronormative. And like CJSF, we believe the reason we as a US society struggle with social emotional intelligence, because it's not just our schools, right? Where our schools mirror our society. That has everything to do with Western dominant thinking, which really separated us from the wisdom in our bodies and our ability to practice healing in the same way that we now practice hygiene. So we believe that like healing should be like brushing our teeth, right? Something we learn how to do at a young age and we practice regularly. But our lack of attention to like addressing that trauma in the body and trauma in the spirit is a result of colonialism and slavery and other systems of oppression. So CFJ believes that racially just public schools must confront the historical legacy and the generational impact of schooling in the US in order to birth a transformational educational system that is built for all of us. So social emotional learning must go beyond the cultural into honoring the diverse identities of our students and affirm student differences as strengths, right? So affirming a young Black student is not the same as affirming someone that is undocumented or gender nonconforming or someone who is holding all of these identities at once, right? And so we believe that fostering welcoming school communities begins with educators, administrators, and staff at all levels of the education system confronting the ways that the systems that I named have seeped into our imaginations and therefore the way we move through the world. So all actors within the system can take steps, right? And can make time and space to pause, reflect, and implement better practices. Because our current educational system has a lot of young people feeling like they don't even belong in the classroom, right? And so incorporating social emotional intelligence will require us constantly checking in with like the racist, sexist, classist thoughts that come up for us as we work with young people. And that's all of us, right? Internally at CFJ, this means that we incorporate mindfulness and embodiment practices in our work. We use breathing meditations both in staff spaces and spaces with our young people. We drop into our body with practices like forward stance. Folks are familiar with forward stance. A mind-body approach to movement building that uses the physical experience to develop, explore, and demonstrate human actions. And we didn't just decide one day to adopt this practice or to like incorporate more of these practices, right? Like Black staff within CFJ called us all out and said we need to take addressing anti-Blackness within our organization more seriously. And so as part of this, we have been inquiring into our individual lineages of anti-Black racism as a predominantly non-Black Latinx staff. So this has involved both individual reflections, peer conversations, journaling, making individual commitments to address anti-Blackness, as well as organizational commitments to shift practices, policies, and procedures. And this is one way that we walk the talk, right? Because in our school transformation work, we ask schools to first put up a mirror, right? We have noticed a tendency for school leaders to want to adopt a practice that is working well in another school or in another community without first taking a real inventory of how these systems of oppression are playing out in their particular context. And in putting up the mirror, we're not asking folks to like make radical shifts, right? Like the opportunity gaps are vast within our system, we can acknowledge that. And you might be called to like pick up that 100-pound weight of historical harm, but we don't have the muscles yet, right? And without the muscles, we can't pick it up. But we can and should grow our muscles. And we can do so through small practices and habit building to shift perceptions, culture, and eventually policies that translate into changing conditions for our young people in the classroom and parents who are navigating, parents and families who are navigating the school system, right? If what you're doing is not translating to the classroom and to the school community, then what are you doing, right? So incorporating social emotional intelligence is not this additional practice that we add to the curriculum. It really must be embedded in school culture and classroom pedagogy. And part of embedding social emotional learning is giving students increased agency and power. So as Carlos talked about, from the classroom to state-level decision-making spaces. And for educators, this can look like co-designing curriculum with students and really drawing from students' culture and lived experience to design learning. At the school level, it looks like both developing the leadership of students and intentionally carving out spaces in all decision-making bodies for student voice. And I say intentionally because we have noticed a trend of both isolating student voice spaces. So you're creating a student advisory committee that has no decision-making power, or you're approaching student voice without an equity lens. So you have student representatives that are not reflective of the students who are experiencing the most harm on campus. So those are some examples. And then some examples of social emotional practices that we have worked with school sites to incorporate student voice. One are culture walks. Many folks are hopefully familiar with culture walks. That is where students do classroom observations and document feedback for teachers. Some like questions to ask when we're implementing culture walks are, what does the school do with this feedback? Right? What is the support for students to develop their recommendations? And then is the school adopting the student recommendations? What does the training for participating students look like? And is there consent from teachers? So things to think about. I'll give two more examples and then I'll close. So student surveys are a common one. A lot of schools are using student surveys to gather student feedback. I want to lift up one example of a district in Canada being really responsive to student survey results. So the district surveyed students and found that 15% of students felt unsafe with school police. And typically when districts find that, they're like, oh, that's a minority of students. But the district was like, wait a minute, like 15%, that represents thousands of students. And it is unacceptable for thousands of students to feel unsafe because of campus police. And so they went ahead and removed all campus police from all campuses. And so that's the type of like receiving student feedback and implementing solutions that we want to see. Some other questions to consider when using student surveys are like, how frequently and by what medium are you surveying students? Are students designing the survey itself? Are you disaggregating the results? And do you know whose voices are missing, right? Who's not responding to your surveys? And lastly, so the other practice we've been working with school sites on is having students actually participate on teacher hiring committees. It's another way to, there's a lot of work we got to do to like diversify our teaching body, but this is one way to address bias in hiring and ensure that our teacher workforce reflects our student bodies as much as possible. It also sets a bar for incoming teachers on what student decision-making looks like on campus, right? And it gives students more agency and helps them form bonds with new teachers from the very start. So thank you. I'm happy to share more, and we do have free resources on all of this that I can share. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Najla. I'm like over here snapping and like pointing my finger because everything is just so on point. And I'm thinking particularly about when you said the current system is not broken, it's working exactly as it was created. And thinking too about Carlos's point that the system tells us that we cannot feel and therefore we cannot heal through that process. So I'm thinking through how do we continue to center that in our conversations about SEL, and exactly why culturally affirming SEL is so important in this conversation. And also, I just wanted to thank you for beautifully modeling, taking deep breaths before engaging, because that's so important, and a personification of what SEL should look like in spaces and in conversations. So thank you so much for that. And so now I'm going to turn back to Carlos. He is going to tell us a little bit more about why do organizers need to know how to do SEL practices, or just adults in general. Why do we need to learn how to do SEL practices? He's also going to talk to you about how do we center listening and healing in narratives about school safety. He's also going to talk to us about what has been proven challenging about building people's SEL capacities. So I'm going to let him lead us through this.
Great. Absolutely. Yes. So one of the things, I think there's a really important conversation happening right now, both in organizing and increasingly in the philanthropic sector, about what does healing justice actually mean, right? Like, what does it mean for oppressed communities and activists and organizers to heal? And there's so many beautiful practices out there, which is why, I'm so thankful to the learning community that you all are organizing, because to me, it's an endeavor to figure out what are those practices. What do they look like concretely, and how do we share and learn from them? For us at Youth on Board, we are dedicated to creating containers where young people get to connect with each other in deep ways, get to practice listening with each other in the hopes of actually getting to be vulnerable with each other about the ways that we've been hurt by the systems of oppression that we live in. At the core, that is how we have seen an entire cohort of young people come through the Youth on Board program, not just learn the basics of organizing, movement building, how to lead a campaign, how to pick a target, how to power map, but also young people are learning how to be able to process their emotions when something really difficult happens. I remember the day that I graduated from high school. I remember the day I woke up after graduating from high school, and I realized that I hadn't figured out how to go to college because of my immigration status. And I think I sort of had been a little bit in denial. I had been celebrating graduation. That was in and of itself a really big accomplishment. But I hadn't quite been honest with myself about the fact that even though all of my peers had gone off to college, I hadn't figured it out. And I just remember getting hit like a ton of bricks. And I remember calling our executive director, and I just cried and cried and cried on the phone, and I couldn't stop it. I couldn't figure out how to say anything. I think I was blubbering and babbling everywhere. And she just knew that what I needed in that moment was to be listened to, and that I needed to hear from her that it was not my fault, that it was not my doing, and that it had everything to do with the oppression. And I just cried. And then when I was done crying, I actually remember the world looking brighter. Like, I looked out my window and I realized that the feelings I'd been having about inadequacy and hopelessness were actually feelings, and that the reality was that I had a community who had my back, that I was up against a system of oppression, and that I was powerful enough to tackle the system of oppression. And that is those are the moments we try to create. Why that's so important to organizers is because we're not doing it enough. And we enter social movements to change the world and to build a different world, but we're often not able to actually practice what that means, right? And I know so many organizers and movement builders who have dedicated their lives to really beautiful organizations and really important causes, who have left, who have burnt out, because we haven't quite figured out how to build that alternative world in our movements. And I always say to myself, like, we're demanding to build a better world out there, and that means we actually have to be building it in our movements ourselves. And so what that looks like concretely at Youth on Board is anywhere from the fact that we always start with laugh and play, and acknowledge the importance that laugh and play hold in human experience, and how often we don't get to play, right? How many of you get to play once a week, once a month? How many of you start meetings with a game? Sometimes, but usually we don't. We try to build a culture of appreciation because we live in a world that tells us all the time we're not doing enough and we're not good enough. So how many of you start your meetings or end your meetings with appreciations every single time? Those are basic practices that we've integrated into our work and our organization that sound really simple and are actually really deeply transformative. And then we do this, and in order to create these containers of vulnerability, we teach the young people and we train young people to use something that we call listening partnerships. And listening partnerships are an incredible opportunity where young people actually get to pair up with each other and agree that they're going to be vulnerable enough with each other in order to process whatever's on their minds, and have agreed to listen to each other, and then have agreed that that's the time they're going to use to work through their emotions. Which means when we come back from the listening partnership, we are back to work. We're back to figuring out how to build a movement, how to tackle a fight. But for that moment, we are going to agree to just listen to each other and be vulnerable enough with each other. So we're actually going to give it a little try on this webinar. And we're doing this because we actually want to challenge everyone on this webinar to out of our comfort zones and actually practice what it feels like to try to be vulnerable enough with someone who you may not have ever met before. And so I'm going to share my screen in 1 second, just to give you a quick sense of how we actually do these. So just going to start with a quick few guidelines for meaningful listening. A lot of you, I'm sure, are very good at listening, but just reminders. It's always a really good idea when you're listening to look like you care or like the person. And so showing warm and kind attention is pretty much foundational to having this succeed. You want to remember the goodness of the person, and we could do a whole training segment on what it means to remember that specifically. But in order to listen effectively to someone, we actually have to know, and we have to actually believe that there's some kind of goodness in the person that you're listening to, right? Imagine how hard it would be to listen to someone if you didn't actually believe that they were good. So in order to do listening partnerships, you pick someone that you pair up with. In this case, we're going to pair you up randomly into a partnership with someone who's on the webinar. You're going to decide who goes first, who goes second. We're going to split equal time, which means that, depending on how much time we have, which is not very much, maybe we'll have you do 2 minutes each in your listening partnership. You split the time equally. You decide who goes first, who goes second. When you're listening, you're not going to give advice. You're not going to talk. You're not going to interject with, oh, yeah, that reminds me of that time that happened to me, because now it's flipped to you. During the time that you're listening, you're just going to listen. And for the person for your speaking turn, you're going to practice radical vulnerability, which to us basically means we all have a circle of comfort that we live in, right? So we usually stay in that circle, especially with strangers. We're going to ask you to sort of dare to take 1 foot out of that circle and step outside that circle to show vulnerability, to show how you actually feel, even if it feels a little scary and a little dangerous to share that much about yourself. And at the end of the listening partnership, you come back and you check with the person who's been speaking and you ask, would you like a grounding question? Grounding questions are silly, short, and quick, and they're meant to bring people back from whatever they were talking about. So it can be as simple as, do you like chocolate or vanilla ice cream? Name 3 countries that start with the letter L. Spell the word or say the word pizza backwards. Anything that's sort of this quick, funny, gets them out of whatever they were thinking, and then it's time to switch. And the last thing before we break off is we have to be able to practice confidentiality. And this is huge in listening partnerships. So our young people and our staff use listening partnerships to work on really, really big and confidential things. And we always say that we need to keep that confidentiality in order for this process to work. So Cierra, I'm wondering, how much time do we actually have, and how much time can people do in their listening partnerships?
Yeah, so let's say each person gets 2 minutes, so 4 minutes total, and then we'll account for about a minute or 2 for transition time.
That's great. And here's what folks are going to look at in your listening partnership. You can use your listening partnership to look at anything from how you're feeling in this moment. Maybe you can look at how uncomfortable it is to be in a breakout room with someone you may not know. It's totally fine to share those feelings. But I also encourage you to look at what in this current moment, in this current political, social moment that we're in, what is it like to be you? What is it like to be you as whoever you are, as a worker, as a student, as a parent, as an organizer, as a funder, carrying multiple identities? What is it like to be you? Take 2 minutes per person to share that with someone and trust that they can handle whatever it is you want to share with them. Does that sound like a plan? People are coming back. Cierra, can I say a quick little homework assignment I might have for folks as people are coming back? I don't want to take too much out of the agenda time, but yeah, as folks are coming back, I hope that you had a good listening partnership. I was telling my listening partner that oftentimes I do a 10, 20, 30-minute partnership per person because sometimes it actually takes that long to process something that's going on in your life. And so your homework assignment or your challenge could be to pick someone in your life that you trust, that you know you can already be vulnerable with, or you want to be vulnerable with, and teach them about a listening partnership and actually practice it with them and see what happens.
Thank you so much, Carlos, for leading us through that. I had the opportunity to attend Youth on Board's Listening Works this fall, and learning about listening partnerships and how I'm able to use it in my own practices with the CJSF team, but also in just my personal life, has proven to be really helpful and really successful. So I'm really thankful to you, Carlos, and to SD, and for everyone at Youth on Board for really centering healing and radical vulnerability in your work. So for the next portion, I'm going to turn it back to Najla. And so we also have a audience question that's embedded into, what Najla will talk about. But the audience question was around teachers and thinking that they need to learn how to manage students' SEL development, but not always necessarily thinking about and reflecting on their own practices. So Najla will talk a little bit more about investing in school staff's SEL practices. But Najla is also going to talk about how we ensure that SEL doesn't get co-opted and continues to be centered in student and community voice. And she will also talk about one of the really jarring statistics that's come out of Californians for Justice. One of the youth-led action research projects that they conducted was they found that 1 out of 3 students in California couldn't name one single caring adult at school. And so Najla will tell you more about that project and how all of that intertwines to create a more inclusive, a more loving, a more affirming school community. So Najla, thank you.
All of that in 10 minutes. That'll be great. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to start with a visualization activity before I tell you all about our relationship-centered schools action research. And so if you're comfortable, you can close your eyes, otherwise lower your gaze. And I'm gonna take you back in time. So take a moment to close your eyes or lower your gaze and prepare to travel back to when you were in high school. So pick a year, every year might have been different for you. Where were you living at the time? What were you wearing around this time? What music were you listening to? What were you being pressured to do or not to do? So really situate yourself in your high school self. And so as a high schooler, I want you to think back to that school staff member. Could have been a classroom aide, a teacher, a counselor, a principal, or a coach that really cared about you. How did that person make you feel? Like, how did you feel when you were around them? You can remember. How did they show you that they cared about you? How do you know that they cared? And as you're ready, you can start traveling back. If you had your eyes closed, you may open them. Thank you. Visualizations can be challenging. You may or may not have gotten very far, and that's okay. Appreciate you for trying it on. And welcome back. Can folks share, in the chat, one word about how that person that cared about you made you feel? How did that person make you feel? And maybe you didn't have anyone, so that's why there's blank. Okay, brilliant, important. Brilliant, important, supported, seen, capable, understood. Or the opposite, right? Not important. Like I didn't belong. There may have been nobody, right? We're talking about like many of our young people can't identify one single caring adult in their school community. And so grounding in that, just like hold your memory as I talk about CFJ's framework for school transformation, because I'm going to talk about what that means for us in California. So I'm going to travel back in time. So in 2014, our young people here in California launched the Student Voice campaign. And that first year, they won state regulations as part of the new local control funding formula, which those who are familiar, it's a more equitable way to fund our schools in California. And what they won put students that are meant to benefit from the formula, so that's low-income youth, foster youth, and English learners, at the center of making decisions that impact their education and their future. Now, implementation of this is a topic for another webinar, so we can add that to the bike rack. But following this victory to secure student voice in school budgeting, CFJ students engaged in a statewide action research project to answer the question, what do students need to be prepared for college, careers, and community life? And CFJ youth leaders collected 2,000 surveys of low-income youth of color, and we held a summit of 100 students, family members, educators, and policy experts to identify priorities for policy, practice, and procedural changes in our educational system. Some of the findings from the surveys include, one, only half of students that we surveyed believed that adults really care about every student. And for African American and Pacific Islander students, this number was even lower. Another statistic, so 1 out of 4 students reported that adults in their school do not make them feel like they matter. And that number was highest by African American and Native American students. And the key finding from the whole research was that students across the state felt that school staff and teachers are the most important resource to help them prepare for college and careers. Relationships with adults, having a caring adult on campus, was named by students as critical for academic and social success. And as was mentioned, like 1 in 3 students currently cannot identify one caring adult on their campus. So that's a problem, right? And just to name the obvious, like bias against students is an impediment for that relationship building to happen. So out of our youth action research emerged the framework for relationship-centered schools, with investing in staff as one of 3 core components. So the 3 components being student voice, which I talked about earlier, investing in staff, and creating space for relationships, which is making structural changes and institutional changes. And one example of investing in staff that I want to share today in our limited time is having our young people lead implicit bias trainings for educators, administrators, and staff as well. So this past year, we reached over 200 teachers and staff, and we hope to continue training teachers and staff around implicit bias. And I want to actually read a testimony from one of our student leaders, Megan Lane, who co-facilitated a 4-hour training for 100 teachers in Long Beach Unified School District. So Megan says, I've trained teachers on implicit bias. Teachers came to listen to us students. What we were doing was so cool that they were learning from us. I think about that day all the time. One of my own teachers went to that training. She corrects herself all the time now. She's very different from how she was in years past. She's aware of what she's been doing wrong. She used to kick students out for being disruptive. Now she steps back, asks what we can do as a class. What can I do to help you out? She wants to get along with us, and I respect her for that. That little training impacted my teacher so much, and that's going to impact so many students. It impacts me right now. What if we students could make that training a part of every teacher's training? How many lives would be changed? How many ways of teaching would be changed? Our schools would be able to give youth a safe place. So that was Megan. And yeah, just like take a breath after that, 'cause I'm always like, damn, Megan. So our young people have a vision for what our schools can look like, and they're out here ready to train to tell their teachers exactly how to run their classrooms, how to develop curriculum, and we need to like put students at the center of professional development for our staff and teachers. And just like one last thing I'll say before we open up to Q&A, we can ensure that social emotional learning doesn't get co-opted by looking to students, families, and educators as the architects of a new normal. From deciding policies and practices to the equitable redistribution of funds, and by drawing on the wisdom and power of diverse systems of knowledge and cultural and linguistic resources, which are modeled by tribal citizens and indigenous cultures. And I cannot go without saying this, like plentiful funding and resources must be committed to creating this vision of historically, culturally, and linguistically responsive schools, which is why we're fighting for schools and communities first in California in 2020. So thank you so much, and I'll be happy to share all of our free online resources that folks can use. You can always reach out to us.
Thank you so much. That was incredible. I loved the visualization and going back to what that feels like, right? Going back to our initial question that grounds us in this webinar is what does culturally affirming SEL look like and feel like? And so I'm looking to the chat box to see if there are any additional questions. And while we look through that, as we have a few more minutes left together, but Najla and Carlos, I wanted to ask you too, what synergies and connections do you see in the work? So I know that many of the folks that are joining us on the calls come from different backgrounds and different positions. So how can organizers, funders, educators, and researchers all work together to really center culturally affirming practices and policies in their SEL work?
I have a thought I can start. I think organizers, for the most part, understand how important this is, and I think many of us already put hours and hours into supporting young people socially, emotionally, and I think we need to start putting that into our grants, and I think we actually need to start showing funders the amount of effort and capacity and time it actually takes to run a youth organization. It isn't just the policies and the advocacies and the hard skills, but it's the wrapping ourselves around young people and supporting them individually. And I think funders need to get smarter about the fact that that is in large part what they're funding, and we need to be able to name it. So I'm happy to see these growing conversations about healing justice, and I invite any funder that is currently on the call to join us in a conversation about what healing justice is and how funders can actually fund it.
I feel like I've said everything I had to say, but if other questions, I'm happy to say more.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And folks, you can please feel free to add any questions that you have in the chat box. And while I wait for those, what additional resources or tools do you suggest to attendees that will be really helpful in doing this work? I know that you've mentioned numerous resources on the call, and we're actually going to be following up with everyone that is signed up for the call with a resource list. Great. So if there's anything else that you want to add, we'd love to highlight those resources at this time.
Great. What I can do is I can type our website, our specific Listening Works project website onto the chat box, and folks can feel free to look at those. We have some resources that are available there for download, and of course our contact information if there's more that we can help folks with.
Yeah, I can do the same. Like I mentioned, we have like an online free resource where we're putting some of these like how-tos, how to do the culture walks, questions you can add to like student surveys that our students have developed that really like highlight different like experiences of young people. So I'll share that in the chat as well.
Amazing. Thank you all so much for joining us in this call today. We appreciate you so much for taking time out of your day to be here. I see one question that's coming in. It says, Najla and Carlos, what other bite-sized practices do you do within your organization? So creative icebreakers, that really situate SEL in your day-to-day work?
I mean, I think part of what we're grappling with at CFJ is that everyone has their own like practices that they already do outside of work. And so how do we create a space internally where folks feel like they can show up as their full selves, you know? And so we have an altar in the office. Like, we just want to create a space where everyone feels comfortable to be their full authentic selves. Are we fully succeeding? Not yet. So we're on the path. But I think that for us is the main thing, is that people are already practicing this outside of this, whether it's, you know, through cooking, whether it's through music. Like, how do we incorporate what people already do into our work?
Right after I say what I'm about to say, I can link some resources directly on some of the smaller practices. But like I said on the webinar, even starting out with getting people to play in your organization and in your meetings, and getting people to practice consistent appreciations of themselves and each other, I think is really simple, but can be really transformative to the culture of your organization. Think and listens are also another tool that we use to have people, and specifically young people, practice what it's like to just listen, think, and share space and time for others to be able to share their thinking. And I can link some more guidance as well.
Amazing. Thank you all so much. As we get ready to wrap, just a few notes that I have in thinking about the entirety of this conversation, especially noting that this is the first SEL webinar that we're hosting that will be a part of a larger series. But some of the learning that has really come out of this is, one, situating culturally affirming SEL really means centering healing through the oppressive structures that have constricted and confined communities of color. And so what does that mean to heal from the system is something I think that we will continue to talk about in future webinars, but also in our daily practices and in our own work. Is a question that we can take away is, how do we heal from the system? But also, how do we create spaces for ourselves, for those that we work with, for young people to really heal from the system? The second thing that I'm thinking about is really just engaging in radical vulnerability, which Carlos and Najla were both beautifully led us through, whether that be in visualizing or whether that be in developing strong listening partnerships, and recognizing that this work is important, this work is hard, it's challenging, but it's vital. And in order to do the work, we have to do it within ourselves, but we need other people to support us through it. So how do we lean on one another in order to do this work? And so just a few logistical notes as we close. We'll be sending out a resource sheet of all of the tools mentioned. So any questions we didn't have a chance to answer, we will scan through the chat box, as well as a summary of key points that came out of the conversation. Thank you all for joining us and sharing space with us. We are so thankful for the connections and for folks that were able to leave their cameras on. And even if not, just being able to engage with us, we really, really appreciate that. Many thanks to Carlos and Najla for sharing their work, but so bravely leading the world in what SEL should look like and feel like. We are so very appreciative of you. And thank you to the CJSF team who worked behind the scenes to put this together. Thank you to Ali, who is on the call to manage logistics and provide technical assistance. And of course, to our fearless leader, Allison Brown, for beautifully opening up this call. We look forward to you joining us at our next webinar, which is tentatively scheduled for Tuesday, January 19th. And so throughout the series, we'll be tackling and discussing topics such as healing-centered engagements even further, food justice, environmental justice, housing justice, and their relationships to SEL, and turning SEL theory into practice and so much more. We hope that you will join us, and thank you so, so much for being with us today. Look forward to engaging with you soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Everyone, thank you.